wanted to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brandflex here, back with another Eternal Return video. So we do have patch 1.8 finally released. This is season 2. I kind of wish they synced up the patch notes with the seasons, but it is what it is. We can get through it. But anyways, let's jump right into it so we can go through the newest patch for the season 2 launch. So just to go over the cosmetics, we do have battle maids being released. If you buy the pass, you'll get Rosie, Bernice, and Aya. Unfortunately, oh, and you actually do get do you also Peel and Sylvia? Oh, these are the non-event skins. So pretty good loadout overall. The Fiora skin unfortunately is locked behind buying the pass, which is an extra lot of MP. Bianca, you're getting the cadet skin and 2 enemy emotes if you got to diamond. So pretty good cosmetics if you push through that first season. We do have Lenny being released. I will make a Lenny video probably tomorrow. She seems very strong. I'll be very surprised if she's weak. She does have the ranged version of a Sua passive, so if you have Sua passive, I kind of refuse to believe that you're gonna be weak. But who knows, her numbers do look kind of suspicious, so we'll see where she goes with that. And we'll just skip through all of these and jump right into the UI changes that we have. So we do have the death overlay finally in the game. Looks very familiar if you've played a certain other game, but it will be nice knowing what exactly you died to, especially if you got bursted and missed it. We do have an AFK change as well, just in case you have a griefer. I think this is, ironically enough, more common between like region to region. So if you were like in Korea, a lot of people would like from NA would come, like NAEU and SA would come to AFK to like level accounts. Then same thing for Korea. I heard a lot of rumors that Koreans, like some very eligible Koreans, would come over and AFK on NA just to grief. So this just punches both ends of it. Pretty nice in my opinion, just getting a bit more punishment into the game overall, and hopefully this will make people AFK less, because it does suck when that happens. We do have a few changes to push to talk, which will only affect new players, so if you're watching this video, probably won't be too relevant, but if you make a smurf, just be aware that these are now in the game as well. We do have changes to duos, which apparently makes it more fair to the duo players. I did hear that duos actually had a massive disadvantage because their RP game was worse than if you solo queued, which is pretty funny. So they're just adjusting that to make it more fair. And they also have shield sound effects now, which is quite interesting. We'll see how those sound when it comes down to it. And we do have a few augment changes, mostly sub-augment changes it seems like. So open wounds getting a buff because this augment is trash. Honestly, they could buff the base damage to 50 and then it'll probably be good, but we're nowhere near that amount yet, so I personally wouldn't take open wounds, but maybe we're at a point where it is actually useful. Steadfast is being added back into the game, which is quite funny considering they took it out for a reason, but I guess the blue tree already had very powerful defensive options, so adding one back into it isn't the worst thing they've done. And then Thorn Shackles is getting a nerf that should have gone at the beginning of the preseason, nerfing it from 5% to 4%, which brings it down to line with about all other sub-augments besides Enma Reaper. So not the worst deal, just making it a bit worse because everything else was a bit worse. For Tac Skills, we do have the Strider being buffed. I'm pretty sure this augment or this Tac skill is still really trash. They really need to increase the range on it, I think, to make it good, but a buff is a buff. It still will proc on anything you do, which means that if you pop it while you have an aura going off, you'll just cancel it immediately. So there's a lot to work on with this Tac skill. Maybe if they just buff the duration by infinity, it'll be fine, but hopefully it doesn't come down to that. Surely they can find a more elegant solution. Weapon skills, we do have Dagger being nerfed very hard. This essentially prevents you from engaging from out of vision unless you are very, very fast, which is a very hefty nerf if you want to escape or just take a cute engage. And Tonfa, I think this is overall a rework, but it is definitely much bigger of a nerf late game because losing 5% when everyone's damage is much higher means a lot more than doing 5% more when everyone's damage is a bit lower. So we'll see how this changes all the Tonfa characters, but probably won't do too much. Nadine is getting a bit of a buff and a nerf, so we'll call her a rework. She gets more passive stacks when she kills enemies, and her Q has been nerfed in compensation, so she's losing 10 base damage on the tap and 20 base damage on the fully charged version, which essentially means that if you get, I think it's like 5 to 10 assists when you, if you get 5 to 10 assists, this essentially negates the nerf entirely and actually becomes a buff once you get above that number. So kind of a Nadine buff. I don't know why they don't want to nerf Nadine just strictly because she was the best character or one of the best characters in the game to climb with for auto attacking. So we'll see where she is. We'll see where she is rather for the season 2.0 release. Tia is getting a buff, gonna do a bit more damage late game, and you can't grieve yourself with W anymore when you're leveling it and routing. Laura is getting a nerf. Laura, once again, one of the better characters in the game at the moment, so her W is getting a revert on the projectile speed, and it'll do a lot less damage early game before it is maxed. So yeah, Laura very strong, so well-deserved nerfs. Dailin also getting some pretty major nerfs in my opinion. So the reason why I say the Q change is a nerf is because you aren't leveling Q for the most part as Dailin until like level 11 to 12. So this is a pretty major nerf to her routing and early to mid game fights. And then arguably it's a buff once you hit late game. And then her ultimate is just getting a pretty big nerf overall. So you'll execute a little bit less. Obviously they state the reasons for this nerf because Dailin was performing a little too well, which I can totally believe. So just a little nerf to our drunk girl over there. Luke is getting a late game buff. I don't think you ever really leveled W until, I don't think you maxed W until like second or third. So it will be a pretty big power spike to Luke's mid game. And we'll see if that puts him over the edge because Luke is very popular in general. Martina is getting a very major buff. Her scaling is essentially doubled through her mastery, and her all attacks will be much better before you hit max level. This is a very insane Martina buff in my opinion, and her ultimate's also getting a shorter cooldown, so maybe Martina can actually compete with the other auto attackers, because you guys have to remember that Nimble Neuron has been changing all the auto attackers to spike earlier in the game so that they're relevant from the very start, which makes no sense because Nadine existed. But essentially Martina's gonna spike harder and faster, and hopefully Martina's won't be dodged on sight anymore when she goes into your game. Mai is getting a very big healing buff, or defensive buff rather, later in the game. Plus 100 HP is nothing to scoff at for free, so we'll see if that ends up mattering that much. Mai was pretty popular, so I'm surprised she's getting a plus 100 heal baseline. But anyways, Markus is getting buffs because Markus was getting pretty underplayed late game. You have to understand that Q hits 3 times, so this is not a 5 and 2% increase. This is more of a 15 to 6% increase, which is pretty decent, but might not put him over the edge. The bigger buff isn't his W, just having more consistent knockups can be pretty huge. Barbara is getting a base defense buff, which kind of mirrors what Camilo had when he started becoming super meta, so maybe this pushes Barbara into being super meta. We'll see about that. And Arda overall is getting a buff. His healing is going up, his W is going up, and his ultimate cooldown is going down. And if you guys don't know what Arda's W does, or rather if you guys don't know how Arda's damage works, this W buff actually affects both his base W and his RW, because all of your ultimate enhanced abilities are based on that basic ability skill level. So if you level up ultimate to level 3 and your W is level 1, you're not getting more damage on your W overall. You're still just getting that level 1 W damage. So this actually impacts Arda a lot more than you might expect if you level W second. So hopefully his early game will be a lot better with that, and also his late game. Well, overall his gameplay would be better with that cooldown reduction on his ultimate as well. Abigail is super strong late game, so this is actually a very small nerf. Just 5% off one of her less spammed abilities. I mean, it's pretty well spammable, but it's not her Q, so won't impact her as much as her Q nerf, but some damage off Abigail's late game is pretty warranted. Sniper Aya getting a buff to her late game scaling. We'll see if that pushes her over the edge. I kind of doubt it. And Isol is being slightly reworked in his E. Essentially, they're making it a lot better in the upper tiers of gameplay where people have cameras, and potentially worse in lower tiers where people don't have cameras. So essentially you're losing the stealth, which was conditionally insane, for a lot more utility on his W or on his E. So going further, having more damage, having better cooldown are all big benefits in exchange for potentially not escaping when people don't have cameras. So probably a buff, but we'll see. Estelle is also getting a rework, which trends towards being a buff for Tank Estelle and potentially a nerf for Amp Estelle. So getting plus 25 base damage first of all is pretty nice, but the W change is huge. This essentially means that your W comes up twice as often, but does half as much. So that means you're getting a lot more damage reduction overall, but the damage you're doing is a lot worse. So we'll see if this makes Estelle healthier or better to play, because changing damage to this degree can really mess with people and their perception of how much burst they do. And it is a very burst heavy meta, so we'll see how Estelle does. Yuki is getting a nerf surprisingly. Didn't think Yuki was that strong, but apparently he was. 0.3 attack power per level is more ironically than I think a lot of more problematic characters get on the regular, so Yuki, not Nimble Neuron's star child. And Leon is finally getting her quality of life change where you can craft while you're possessed. So Nai's little optimizations early game won't matter as much because now you can just craft normally like a normal player and normal character. So that's quite nice. 11 is getting, in my opinion, a very undeserved compensation buff to what she got nerfed by or in the hotfix last week. 11 is probably still by far the best RP printer, from anywhere from bronze to like low mithril. So it's a bit weird they're buffing her again, but we'll see if maybe the meta has changed enough with all the changes they've done to make 11 worse, but I kind of doubt it. Karla is getting a buff to her ultimate because if we're being honest, her ultimate was quite meh. And it still is quite meh, but late game, if she hits it, she'll slow you for a lot more, so maybe it'll be fine. We'll see if that changes Karla's late game power at all. Tazia, after her major rework over the preseason, is continuing to see buffs just because they think Tazia is not performing well. We will really see Tazia's true power level when One Circle starts playing her again, if he starts playing her again. She did eat a very major nerf in the preseason, so we'll see where power level is later. Priya is also getting a pretty good buff. 40% damage reduction on her ultimate is almost good enough to maybe warrant her never taking Totem ever again as this character. I do know that the opinions on Totem Priya were pretty split, but I do think it was pretty invaluable to just negate all damage as opposed to taking less damage. So we'll see where she lands, if she even is played this next patch. Fiora is getting a pretty big buff, plus 20 damage, or it's actually plus 40 damage to her max W. It is very insane when you consider that her W is on a 4-second cooldown, I think, baseline. So with CDR, you're looking at a 3-second cooldown, getting plus 40 damage if you hit both ends. Quite the buff. We'll see if that puts her into being super meta. Kind of doubt it though, she seems really hard to play in squads. We have Haze being buffed a lot. This is kind of a weird change because it kind of narrows her skill expression. They're making it so that the difference between hitting her center Q and her normal Q is just gonna be 40 base damage and 5% skill amp, which granted is a good amount, but when you consider the fact that before this, like this current patch, or I guess this previous patch, it was a 60 base damage difference and a 10% skill amp difference, that's a huge like diminishing, like flatlining of her skill expression. So I think Haze already has a lot going on, so it's a warranted change. It's just funny seeing her change to that degree. And Hyejin is getting a pretty major buff. If you guys have played Hyejin before, you guys have probably experienced how SP hungry your character is. So the fact that you're getting a much cheaper Q and a much cheaper E is insane, because this means that Hyejin might be able to take, you know, actual combat augments and not have to craft insane amounts of drinks. So quite a nice quality of life change for Hyejin there. Moving on to the weapons, we do have pistol auto attackers being buffed a very small amount. I think Kelt was already better than Molten Malachite personally, but I know a lot of people were saying that Molten Malachite was probably better because it's a cheaper item, which I could believe, but now there's more reason to build Kelt over Molten Malachite. Molten Malachite's still probably the better spike because it is way cheaper, but Kelt now is maybe good enough to run over Molten Malachite if you have the opportunity to run it. Glove, Permafrost, is being buffed a tiny bit. Guitar, these all translate to heart buffs, which is kind of scary, but with Crossbow Nadine kind of being the queen of all auto attackers, makes sense that they would want to push heart a bit higher. Karwinen, Weight of the World, being nerfed a little bit in their passives, but Karwinen does get plus 3 AP in exchange, so I think that's actually a pretty major buff to early game Leon. And then we do have Squeaky Hammer, which is the upgraded version of Weight of the World, being buffed. Potentially, it lost 30% attack speed, but instead it's getting 10% CDR and the auto attack slow passive. It does also lose 4 attack power, but I don't think this is really built on any character period. So now it's just more of a upgrade for Tank 11, just so that she has a bit more utility and options when she's going for upgrades. For Nunchucks, we do have a Hydra Nerf and a Crimson Red Lovers buff, which is pretty minor, so nothing to really talk about. And we do have a very major Pedal Torrent nerf. I do think Alex was the only character that built Pedal Torrent, so this really hurts Alex, but Alex seemed pretty good at the end of Season 1, so maybe this is warranted. We'll have to see though in his stats if people play Alex into Season 2.0. For whips, there's 3 entries, but really the only one you have to care about is Sword of Scales being buffed a little bit, which I believe is Lennox's weapon. And then throw, these changes essentially translate to mostly a William buff besides Grade of Antioch range increase nerf, so we'll see where that goes. For armors, we do see a very massive Cardinal Rhodes buff, which is the heel cut mage chest piece, and we do have a very minor High Priest Rhodes buff. Tac armor is being buffed as well, getting its execution range increased from 6% to 8%, which is very massive. And then Decomp is potentially getting nerfed or buffed, depending on how the math works. I know the patch notes have numbers, but I don't trust Nimble Neuron's patch notes after what they did with this item last patch. So I think it's probably good, but we won't know until the game pushes out the patch all the way. At least in Halo is getting a very minor buff, not bad. For arm pieces, we do have buffs to the amp arms overall. Auto arms, I'm pretty sure it's a pretty big buff for auto arms. And then we do have sports watch and Cerulean timepiece getting more damage on their auto attacks respectively, which might push them into being pretty good, which is mostly a Jenny buff. And we do have Tyndall's Monarch getting a defense buff. For legs, we do have Boots of Hermes getting a pretty massive buff in my opinion. Remember that it still has its tenacity, so losing 6 defense for 15% CDR is a huge buff for all tanks. So besides that, we do have some minor food changes. Don't think it'll make a big difference. We do have the gold foods being a lot better. And then for summons, we do have some changes to portable campfires being stackable, acupuncture mats being a bit better, and then C4 also being a bit better. And we do have some tooltip fixes where they did change around the CC durations, but who really cares about that? And everything else is going to be cobalt and bug fixes. I'll be honest, I haven't really played the patch, so I don't know how many bugs there were, but Nimble Neuron always does its best, always does their best, making sure that the bugs are all ironed out. So yeah, as always, the patch notes will be linked in the description and probably the pinned comment, and tomorrow should be the Lenny guide / gameplay video, mostly first impressions though. But yeah, that's gonna be it for this video. I hope you guys have a good day or night wherever you are, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye bye.